1st century, Caligula was a Roman emperor who, after surviving a serious illness and forcing his senators to end their own lives for unknown reasons, declared himself a living god and demanded worship. He then ordered statues of himself placed in temples, including in Jerusalem, nearly triggering revolt. He claimed to speak with the god Jupiter, and often dressed as various gods, including the moon goddess Luna, whom he claimed to sleep with. Then, in order to disprove an astrologer's prophecy, he built a floating bridge 3 miles long across the Bay of Baia, using ships, then rode across it in a golden chariot wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The spectacle drained resources and caused a grain shortage in Rome. He also fed his guests gold-dusted bread at banquets and wore women's robes and silk slippers in public to provoke outrage. At his parties, he watched people be brutally killed, inviting their grieving loved ones to join and forcing them to act like they were having a good time. Caligula also loved to humiliate his senators, forcing them to run beside his chariot and attending their dinner parties only to sleep with their wives. Later, he dressed his horse, Incitatus, in fine robes and declared it a priest. By 40 AD, he had decided to invade Britain, but instead declared war on Neptune, collecting seashells on the beaches of Gaul and declaring them spoils of a great victory over the sea. He also revived Tiberius's treason trials, randomly targeting citizens for torture, exile, or execution while seizing their property. His increasingly erratic and brutal rule led to his assassination in 41 AD. 2nd century. Carpocrates of Alexandria was a Gnostic cult leader in Egypt who preached that souls must commit every possible sin to break free from the cycle of reincarnation and ascend to the highest spiritual realm. He rejected all moral laws, calling them evil, and saw personal responsibility or sexual restraint as corruptions of divine truth. He also claimed Jesus was a mere human whose soul escaped reincarnation by embracing all sins. He led his followers into ritual and communal orgies, saying women need to be shared for procreation. His group practiced free love as a rejection of private ownership and societal norms. Carpocrates also used rituals to summon spirits, believing they guided his followers to liberation. 3rd century. Elagabalus became Roman emperor at just 14 and replaced traditional Roman religion with the worship of Elagabal, a Syrian sun god represented by a black stone, forcing top officials to take part in foreign rites. He even constructed a grand temple to house this black stone and allegedly sacrificed young boys to his god. He married a Vestal virgin, an act punishable by death, along with 4 other women and a gladiator named Heracles, whom he publicly called his wife. Elagabalus openly wore makeup, wigs, women's clothing, and removed all body hair. He also prostituted himself in his palace and promised rewards to doctors who could give him female genitalia. He disrupted Senate meetings by exposing himself, drove a chariot pulled by naked women through Rome, and released wild animals during dinners. He was assassinated at 18. 4th century. Macarius of Egypt was a Christian desert monk who lived in a cave, ate only raw herbs, and slept in a coffin to mock death. As penance, he carried a 50-pound stone everywhere he went. To test his faith, he once sat on a scorpion nest, believing the stings purified his soul. Macarius also claimed to physically wrestle demons that tormented him in the desert. His practices shocked even fellow monks, who saw his behavior as a form of divine madness, though many still followed him. 5th century. Simeon Stylites was a Syrian Christian who spent 37 years living on top of a pillar near Aleppo, never coming down, enduring all weather without shelter. He bound himself with ropes that dug into his flesh, attracting worms which he treated as divine agents, placing them back into his wounds when they fell out. Crowds gathered to watch him stand in constant prayer. Simeon's followers raised his pillar from 6 to 60 feet over time at his request, since he wanted more isolation from crowds. He preached daily to pilgrims from a platform atop the pillar. 6th century, Dasu Hukei, the second patriarch of Chan Buddhism in China, is remembered for his extreme act of devotion. Though already seen as enlightened, he was criticized for lacking a teacher. Around age 40, he sought out monk and founder of Shaolin Kung Fu, Bodhidharma, at Shaolin Monastery, standing waist deep in snow all night outside the master's cave to prove his sincerity. When Bodhidharma still refused him, calling him unworthy, Huike cut off his left arm and presented it as proof of his dedication. Only then was he accepted as a student. Huike later gained recognition, reportedly living to 107 years old. He was later honored with the title Great Ancestor. 7th century, Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in Chinese history, rose from low-ranking concubine to absolute ruler by eliminating anyone in her way, rivals, loyal advisors, and members of her own family. To gain power, she allegedly killed her infant daughter to frame the empress, and used this as a stepping stone to control the throne through puppet emperors. She later created a secret police force known for torture and devised new methods of execution. Wu also maintained a harem of young men, often monks, for sexual rituals, and discarded them when they failed to please her. One was strangled by palace women after he burned down a monastery in retribution for Wu taking a new lover. Her ruthlessness earned her a reputation as a ruler feared by both gods and men. 8th century, Constantine V, Byzantine emperor, ruled with a mix of violent paranoia and religious extremism. He launched a fanatical campaign against religious icons, like paintings or statues depicting Jesus or Mary. He didn't just ban them, but tortured, mutilated, and publicly humiliated anyone associated with them. Monks were flogged, disfigured, or forced to marry prostitutes in public purification rituals. He ordered mass destruction of Christ's images and created a state theology where only he was the proper image of God on earth. Dissenters were blinded or executed in mass displays. Even dead saints weren't spared. He had the remains of iconophile bishops dug up and thrown into the sea. He even blamed monks and nuns for natural disasters, parading them through the hippodrome after a storm wrecked his fleet. His madness extended beyond religion. After defeating the Bulgars, he handed their prisoners to the mob for execution and also ordered live dismemberments or burnings of enemies. 9th century, Pope Stephen VI was a bishop of Rome infamous for the Cadaver Synod. Driven by hatred for his predecessor, Pope Formosus, Stephen ordered Formosus' 9-month-old corpse exhumed, dressed in papal robes and propped up on a throne to stand trial. A deacon was forced to defend the rotting body while Stephen accused it of illegally becoming pope and screamed questions at it. The dead Formosus was declared guilty, stripped of all titles, and had the 3 fingers used for blessings cut off. His corpse was buried in a grave for foreigners, then dug up again and thrown in the Tiber River. Stephen's grotesque spectacle triggered a public backlash. He was imprisoned during an uprising and later strangled in his cell. After his death, Formosus was posthumously reinstated and a law was passed forbidding trials of the dead. 10th century. Gadid or Yodid was an exiled Ethiopian princess, the daughter of the last Aksumite king Dil Naat. She returned to lead a brutal revolt against the Christian Aksumite dynasty. Possibly of pagan or Jewish background, she rallied her people, sacked Aksum, burned churches and monuments, and hunted down priests. She killed the emperor, got rid of the heirs, seized the throne, and ruled for 40 years, attempting to wipe out the royal bloodline entirely. Known as Esato for her fiery destruction, she left the empire in ruins. 11th century, Peter the Hermit was a French priest who lived in filth, never bathed, and survived on fish and wine. Claiming to have received a letter from heaven, he led thousands of untrained peasants on the disastrous People's Crusade, convincing them that God would shield them from harm. Most were slaughtered before reaching their goal. Another mention in this century has to be Al-Hakim Biam Allah, the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt, who banned grapes, shoes, chess, and killed all of Cairo's dogs, believing they were demons. He also destroyed Christian holy sites like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and enforced absurd laws like the prohibition of Jews and Christians from riding horses or forbidding fish without scales. He barred women from leaving home and even banned the making of women's shoes. Known to ride a donkey naked at night, he later declared himself divine and vanished into the desert, which led to the rise of the Druze religion that worshipped him as a god. 12th century, Christina the Astonishing was a Belgian woman who reportedly died from a seizure, then shocked mourners by rising during her funeral and levitating to the rafters of the church. She claimed to have seen heaven, hell, and purgatory, and chose to return to earth to suffer for sinners. Her life became a spectacle of bizarre self-punishment, living in trees, towers, ovens, and even freezing rivers to avoid the stench of sin she claimed to smell on others. She allegedly survived being thrown into mill wheels and became known for her wild, erratic holiness that baffled her contemporaries. 13th century. Emperor Frederick II was an Italian Holy Roman Emperor known for his weird obsessions. He ran cruel experiments to uncover human nature, including raising infants in silence to find humanity's natural language. Most of his test subjects died. He also dissected people to study digestion, feeding two men identical meals and killing them at different times to inspect their stomachs. Frederick also kept a vast traveling zoo at his court in Sicily. He bathed multiple times a day, odd for this time, and clashed constantly with the church, being excommunicated 4 times. His secular views earned him the title Antichrist. 14th century. Catherine of Siena was an Italian mystic who claimed a spiritual marriage to Jesus, saying he gave her an invisible ring made from his foreskin. She practiced extreme fasting, often surviving solely on the Eucharist, which ultimately led to her death at 33. To imitate Christ's suffering, she reportedly drank pus from lepers' wounds and lived in a cell where she would scream in religious trances. Her visions and self-mortification earned her sainthood despite the disturbing nature of her devotion. 15th century. Vlad the Impaler, ruler of Wallachia, today's Romania, became infamous not only for impaling tens of thousands, but also for his disturbing personal habits. He was said to dine calmly among forests of impaled, still living victims, dipping his bread in their blood, and kept barrels filled with the severed noses of his enemies. Some accounts claim Vlad forced family members to eat each other, and he reportedly boiled and roasted 300 locals alive, feeding their flesh to the others until none remained. 16th century. Elizabeth Bathory, aka the Blood Countess, was a Hungarian noblewoman who allegedly tortured and murdered dozens of young girls, bathing in their blood to preserve her youth. The victims were lured to her castle under the pretense of domestic service, then subjected to sadistic torments that included stabbing with needles, biting flesh from their bodies, clawing with iron talons, and being burned. Bodies were often tossed over the castle walls to wolves or buried in shallow graves in the castle courtyards. As her crimes and insanity escalated to include girls from aristocratic families, the Hungarian king launched an investigation. Found guilty, she was walled inside her castle in 1610 and left to die 4 years later. 17th century. Athanasius Kircher was a German Jesuit polymath. He had himself lowered directly into the smoking crater of Mount Vesuvius, convinced volcanoes acted as the Earth's lungs. Kircher also came up with the infamous Katzenklavier, a cat piano in which live cats, each chosen for a different meow pitch, were strapped in cages so pressing a keyboard would strike their tails to produce a sound. He suggested it as entertainment for sad nobles. Another mention in this century is Johann Conrad Dippel, a German theologian and alchemist born at Castle Frankenstein near Darmstadt, who later returned there to conduct gruesome experiments. He claimed to have created an elixir of life, known as Dippel's oil, by distilling animal bones and human corpses. Rumors circulated that he robbed graves and tried transferring souls between bodies using crude surgery. Dippel was excommunicated repeatedly for heretical beliefs, like denying the Trinity, claiming immortality could be achieved with chemistry, and calling clergy demonic frauds. He later declared he had independently invented gunpowder, despite it being known for centuries. Dippel was then expelled from numerous towns, imprisoned and widely despised. 18th century. Marquis de Sade was a French nobleman, political radical and notorious libertine, whose name gave rise to the term sadism. Best known for his graphic and violent erotic novels like The 120 Days of Sodom and Justine, de Sade lived a life defined by sexual cruelty, blasphemy, and obsession with power and degradation. His crimes included sexual assault, poisoning, starving, and imprisoning young men and women at his castle in Lacoste, where he acted out his darkest fantasies involving knives, whips, candle wax, and religious desecration, including forcing a woman to use a crucifix during the act. He was condemned to death and fled to Italy, only to return and resume his madness. After numerous imprisonments, he was declared insane and locked in asylums. De Sade spent 27 years in prisons and asylums, with even other prisoners kept away from him due to his attempts to seduce them. His fiction, banned and burned across Europe, portrayed sexual assault, torture, child abuse, and murder as philosophical expressions of unrestrained human will. But we have to mention another Frenchman in this century, Tarare, who ate constantly. Live animals like eels, cats, snakes, lizards, puppies, stones, and corks, due to his unnaturally large appetite and flexible mouth and stomach. His stench was apparently unbearable. He sweated constantly and he would scavenge in trash cans or fight stray dogs for offal. Used briefly as a human undercover courier by the military to smuggle messages in boxes he would swallow, he later horrified doctors by drinking patients' blood, attempting to eat corpses, and possibly devouring a toddler. 19th century. Grigory Rasputin was a Russian mystic and faith healer who claimed to have spiritual insight. Rasputin left his family behind and traveled to holy sites across Russia and beyond, living on alms and spreading his warped gospel. He never bathed, his beard was always full of gunk, and yet his following grew. In St. Petersburg, he quickly attracted churchmen and aristocrats who were mesmerized by his prophetic energy. In 1905, he met Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra. Their sick hemophiliac son, Alexei, was near death. Rasputin prayed over the boy and the bleeding stopped. Whether by hypnosis or coincidence, the miracle won him total protection. From then on, he was untouchable. Rasputin didn't pursue women. They came to him in waves, begging for his touch. He preached that sin cleansed the soul and brought one closer to God. They believed him, so he built a bizarre sex cult around himself. Husbands even encouraged it, thinking it holy. He barely spoke. When he did, it was low and slow. "You're different. God chose you," he'd say. His gaze, greasy fingers, and utter confidence cracked every room he entered. He also drank heavily, wore silk robes gifted by devotees, partied constantly, groped women in public, and chose government ministers from the Tsarina's side. Nobles were furious. His stench was legendary, his scandals constant, yet women craved him more. He was stabbed in 1914 by a mad follower and survived. Later, he was poisoned, shot, beaten, and thrown in a river. When his body was found, water in his lungs suggested he was still alive when he went under. 20th century. Ed Gein, or the Butcher of Plainfield, was an American murderer who haunted rural Wisconsin in the 1950s. He He became one of the most grotesque figures in American crime history, not for the body count, but for what he did with the bodies. Officially, he was convicted of murdering 2 women, but the real horror came from what police found when they searched his isolated farmhouse. Inside, they uncovered a collection of items made from human remains: chairs upholstered with flesh, bowls carved from skulls, masks stitched from female faces, and a full woman suit fashioned from skin. But Gain wasn't just a killer, he was a grave robber obsessed with death and transformation. His mother was a religious fanatic who taught him all women were evil. After she died, he descended into madness. He dug up freshly buried female corpses that resembled her, hoping to resurrect her. He also claimed he wanted to become his dead mother. He skinned the dead and wore their flesh, walking around in his suit at night like a second skin. He even kept skinned heads, severed lips, and vulvas preserved in boxes. 21st century. Dennis Avner, better known as Stalking Cat, was an American who devoted his life to physically transform into a female tiger. A former Navy veteran and later a computer programmer, Avner underwent more than 14 extreme procedures. His upper lip was surgically split, his ears pointed, and silicone implants inserted into his face to reshape his features. His entire body was covered in tiger-striped tattoos, his teeth were filed into fangs, and he embedded 18 piercings to anchor nylon whiskers. He also wore green contact lenses and often sported a remote-controlled robotic tail. But Avner also adapted his speech patterns, changed how he ate, and dressed in a way that supported his identity as a tiger trapped in a human body.